Is ancient religion just empty rituals? It's a super common question, and frankly, a pretty prevailing myth. We hear classical Judaism described all the time as this strictly legalistic system, right? The stereotype is that it was completely obsessed with just outward actions, measuring every single little step, meticulously tracking what you eat, exactly when you wash, basically just robotic observance. But was it really just about going through the motions? Okay, let's dive into this. This misconception right here is honestly one of the most widespread misunderstandings of ancient faith. It treats religion like a dry checklist of rigid external laws, totally devoid of any inner spiritual meaning. A lot of people just assume the ancients didn't really care about what was going on in your head or your heart, just as long as your hands were doing the right thing. But as we'll see straight from the primary sources, that literally could not be further from the truth. So here's our roadmap to dismantle this myth today. First, we'll go beyond empty rituals and define a crucial concept called Kavanah. Then, we'll explore the inner life of the law, the ethics behind the sacrifices, jump into the duties of the heart, and finally look at where action actually meets intention. Let's get right to it. Starting off with Section 1, Beyond Empty Rituals. To really get a grasp on the rabbinic mindset, we absolutely have to look at how they viewed the connection between what a person does on the outside and what they're actually feeling on the inside. When we dig into the source texts, a really fascinating picture emerges. See, our modern minds love to create this strict wall between ceremonial and external actions on one side and ethical, inward feelings on the other. It's like we want to put them in separate boxes. But the historical texts show us that this assumption is completely unjustified. The ancient rabbis simply didn't separate the two. To them, a physical ritual without an ethical heart wasn't just a lesser ritual. It was fundamentally broken. Moving into Section 2, Defining Kavanah. To see exactly how they bridged this gap, we need to look at a very specific piece of Hebrew terminology that completely shatters that false dichotomy we just talked about. Now, what's really interesting here is when we look at this historical list of rabbinic value concepts, which is pulled straight from the primary sources, by the way, a major detail jumps out. Right alongside core ethical ideas like love for the Jewish people and humility, you'll see kavanah, or intention. It is baked right into the rabbinic worldview. We're talking about a primary building block of their entire religious system, definitely not just some afterthought. So what does this actually mean in practice? Well, kavanah is defined as the intention, the inward reflection or the intense spiritual concentration that is literally required during the performance of a religious act. You can kind of think of it as the soul of the action. Without kavanah, the action itself is just an empty shell. That inner psychological state wasn't just some optional bonus points for the super spiritual folks. It was a mandatory requirement for the act to even be considered valid. Which brings us to Section 3, the inner life of law. This is where we get to see how this intention actually plays out in the texts by looking at the dynamic relationship between halacha, which is the law, and agadah, the storytelling and philosophy. You see, even in the absolute densest legal discussions, the system never loses its focus. The sources point out that Haggadah, the storytelling aspect, actively provides the rationale for the actual legal practices. Take the compilation Midrash Ruth Rabbah, for example. It contains virtually zero regulations on purification rituals. Instead, the whole thing is entirely focused on teaching the immense reward of good deeds and loving kindness. And on top of that, the Midrash on Psalms explicitly points out that God grants simultaneous rewards for both inner faith and outward observance. The law and the inner life are quite literally walking hand in hand. Moving to Section 4, Ethics Behind the Sacrifices. Let's apply all this to what is arguably the ultimate symbol of ancient empty ritual, the animal sacrifices at the temple. I mean, if anything was just going through the bloody, ceremonial motions, surely it was this, right? Well, actually, this brilliantly illustrates our exact point. The sacrifices were highly ethical and incredibly inward-focused. The rabbinic sources clearly outline that anyone bringing a sacrifice for a sin had to go through a deeply rigorous psychological process. Step 1, of course, is the sin itself. But look at Step 2, inward repentance. Step 3 is vocal confession, actually acknowledging the specific wrong out loud. It's only after all of that that we arrive at Step 4, the physical sacrifice. The external ritual is really just the final culminating step of a massive inward transformation. And honestly, even the sheer atmosphere of the temple was carefully designed for the inner life. Just look at this quote from Maimonides in his famous work Guide for the Perplexed, talking about the Levite choir. He writes, "The object of the singing is to produce certain emotions. This object can only be attained by pleasing sounds and melodies." So the choir wasn't just there for empty pomp and circumstance. Not at all. It was a highly calculated method specifically meant to spark deep, internal, emotional engagement from every single person standing there. On to Section 5, Duties of the Heart. This internal focus we've been talking about, it only grew stronger over time. Let's fast forward a bit and look at the medieval Jewish philosophical texts, specifically focusing on a profoundly influential work literally called The Duties of the Heart. So the crucial point here is captured just perfectly in the text itself. It says, "For no act of any kind is done completely unless the soul delights in doing it." I mean, just let that sink in for a second. The foremost ethicists of the entire tradition explicitly declared that an outward action is essentially incomplete, and frankly, in many contexts, totally invalid, if it doesn't have that inner spiritual joy. It is the absolute polar opposite of mindless ritual. The text actually goes on to make this profound philosophical argument. It states that if the soul weren't involved, then the obligation to ethical conduct would also be removed from the body and its members. Classical thinkers viewed the physical body performing the act and the ethical soul intending the act as a package deal. They were fundamentally inseparable. You simply cannot mandate the body to do good without simultaneously mandating the heart to actually feel good about it. Which brings us to our sixth and final section, action meets intention. Having looked at all this historical evidence, let's move ahead and summarize this massive paradigm shift we've explored today. So, what does this all mean? What's our big takeaway? Well, in the classical rabbinic mind, there is simply no separation whatsoever between the ethical and inward and the ceremonial and external. They are literally two sides of the exact same coin. True observance isn't about choosing between being a good person on the inside or following the rules on the outside. It's the perfect marriage of outward action and inward intention, a true fusion of halakha and kavanah.